By the time 14-year-old Henry Blackmere understood that his father had brought another woman home, the entire household had already gone silent. He stood at the top of the great staircase, one hand resting against the carved oak rail, watching through the tall entrance windows as his father's carriage rolled to a stop beneath the stone archway. The Duke of Blackmere stepped out first, dressed as though he were returning from an ordinary journey to London. Then a woman followed him. She was young, beautiful, elegantly dressed, and far too comfortable for someone arriving unannounced at another woman's home. But none of that was what made Henry's stomach tighten. Around her throat rested a magnificent emerald necklace, his mother's necklace. Henry had seen Duchess Eleanor wear those emeralds at Christmas balls, royal dinners, and formal receptions for as long as he could remember. Once, when he was younger, she had laughingly told him that one day, when he married, they would belong to his wife. Now they rested against the throat of Lady Celeste Vane. The servants lining the entrance hall noticed too. No one spoke as the Duke walked inside with Celeste beside him, making no attempt to explain her presence or the jewels she wore. Then Eleanor appeared at the upper landing. Henry turned toward his mother, expecting anger. Instead, she descended with such controlled calm that it unsettled him more than fury would have. His father did not apologize. Before his wife, his son, and half the household, Alistair announced that Lady Celeste would be staying at Blackmere indefinitely. Then came the cruelty Henry had not expected. The Duke declared that his marriage to Eleanor was effectively over. Once the necessary legal arrangements had been made, Eleanor would leave the main house and take up residence at the smaller dower property. Henry stared at his father in disbelief. Blackmere had been his mother's home for as long as he had been alive. Yet Alistair spoke as though he were dismissing an inconvenient guest. When Henry protested that his mother could not simply be driven from her own home, the Duke silenced him with the certainty of a man who had never imagined his authority could be questioned. Blackmere was his estate. The house, the land, everything beneath its roof belonged to him. For the first time, Eleanor looked directly at her husband, and then something extraordinary happened. She smiled, not warmly, not bitterly, simply with the calm expression of someone who had just heard another person make a very expensive mistake. She quietly suggested that before Alistair moved so much as another trunk into Blackmere, he should speak with his solicitor, because there was one detail concerning the estate that the Duke of Blackmere had apparently never bothered to understand. Whose name was actually on it? 4 weeks earlier, Henry had still believed his father controlled everything. He had no idea how wrong he was. 4 weeks earlier, Blackmere still seemed unshakable. To Henry, the estate had always felt less like property than a kingdom with invisible borders. From the upper windows of the great house, he could see only a fraction of it, the dark line of the western woods, fields divided by ancient stone walls, tenant cottages clustered along narrow roads, and church spires rising from villages whose names he had known since childhood. One day, all of it was supposed to become his responsibility. His tutors spoke constantly of the title he would inherit, the land attached to it, and the privileges that came with being the future Duke of Blackmere. But Eleanor spoke about something else. People. That morning, she took Henry several miles from the great house to visit Thomas Miller, one of Blackmere's tenant farmers. A winter illness had kept Thomas from working for weeks, and with 2 failed harvests behind him, his family had fallen behind on their rent. Henry expected his mother to discuss payment. Instead, Eleanor sat beside Thomas's exhausted wife, asked about the children, arranged for grain to be delivered from the estate stores, and quietly instructed the steward to postpone the family's rent until spring. On the carriage ride home, Henry asked why she had not simply collected what was owed. Eleanor looked through the window at the fields passing beside them and told him that owning land was the smallest part of inheritance. Blackmere included nearly 20 villages and tenant farms, thousands of acres of woodland and farmland, cottages, workshops, grazing fields, and families whose grandparents had served the estate long before Henry was born. A good landlord did not measure his wealth only by what those people paid him. He measured it by what happened to them when hardship came. Henry remembered those words. They were different from the lessons his father preferred. Alistair spoke of Blackmere as proof of who they were. The ancient house, the family crest, the hunting grounds, the portraits of dead dukes watching from the gallery walls. And lately, Alistair had hardly been there at all. His visits to London had grown longer and more frequent. Business, he always said, investments, opportunities too important to explain at the dinner table. Then, one rainy afternoon, he returned 2 days earlier than expected. Henry heard his parents arguing before he even reached the library. Alistair wanted money released from one of the estate accounts. Eleanor refused. Through the partly closed door, Henry heard something about a railway concern, mining rights, and Lord Edmund Ashcombe. His father's voice sharpened. He reminded Eleanor that he was the Duke of Blackmere. There was a brief silence before Eleanor answered that being Duke did not make every decision he made a wise one. Henry stepped away before either of them discovered him. He loved his father. That was what made the growing coldness between his parents so difficult to understand. Alistair had taught him to ride, taken him hunting for the first time, and once carried him nearly 2 miles home after Henry broke his ankle near the northern lake. Henry could not reconcile that man with the one whose voice now seemed permanently angry whenever Eleanor questioned him. 2 days later, a letter arrived from London. Henry happened to be in the entrance hall when the footman handed it to his father. Alistair glanced at the handwriting and immediately turned the envelope over. The movement was small, but Henry noticed. So did Eleanor. Alistair slipped the letter into his coat before leaving the room. Later, Henry passed his father's study and saw the discarded envelope lying partly beneath the desk. Only one name appeared beneath the London address: Celeste. Henry had never heard it before. That night, unable to sleep, he saw light beneath the study door. His father was standing over the fireplace, feeding papers into the flames, one sheet at a time. Henry should have returned to bed. Instead, he waited in the darkness until Alistair left. One document had fallen beside the grate before the fire could consume it completely. Henry picked it up. Most of the page was blackened, but 3 things remained clearly visible: Lord Ashcombe's name, a figure that made Henry stare twice, £180,000, and beneath it, beside the word security, a single name: Blackmere. The burned paper remained in Henry's thoughts for days. He did not understand the full meaning of the figure written beside Lord Ashcombe's name, but he understood enough to know that £180,000 was not the sort of sum a man casually forgot. More troubling was the word beneath it: Blackmere. Henry considered telling his mother what he had found, but before he could decide, his father left for London again. When Alistair returned several days later, he did not return alone. Henry was standing at the top of the great staircase when the carriage entered the courtyard, bringing the moment that would divide his childhood into everything that came before it and everything that followed. His father stepped down first. Then came Lady Celeste Vane. She was beautiful, in the deliberate way of a woman accustomed to being watched. Her traveling coat was trimmed in pale fur, her gloves immaculate, despite the journey, and she entered Blackmere without the uncertainty of a guest, arriving somewhere for the first time. Around her throat rested Eleanor's emerald necklace. Henry recognized it immediately. By the time his mother descended the staircase, the servants had already understood that this was no ordinary visitor. Alistair did not bother pretending otherwise. Celeste was to occupy rooms in the east guest wing, and within hours it became obvious that her stay was not intended to be brief. She inspected rooms as though they were awaiting her approval. She spoke of replacing the faded curtains in the morning salon. She wondered aloud whether several older servants might be retired. She suggested changing the dinner hour because London society preferred to dine later, and casually mentioned the friends she hoped to invite once the season ended. Each small remark seemed designed to tell Eleanor that another woman was already imagining herself at the center of Blackmere. Eleanor responded to none of it. Her calm only made Henry more furious. That evening, Alistair ordered a formal family dinner. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, arrived before sunset, already aware enough of the situation to look deeply uncomfortable. Beatrice cared fiercely about the Blackmere name, and for most of her life, she had believed that whatever happened inside a noble family should remain invisible to those outside it. At dinner, Celeste was seated beside Alistair. More pointedly, she occupied the place Henry had always known as his mother's. Eleanor sat farther down the table. Henry could barely eat. Then his father finally announced what everyone had been pretending not to know. He intended to seek a formal separation. Once the necessary arrangements were completed, Eleanor would leave the main house and take up residence at the old Dower property beyond the southern gardens. Alistair presented it as though every detail had already been settled. Eleanor would have a respectable allowance. Her staff would be reduced. Public appearances would be managed carefully enough to protect the family from unnecessary scandal. Then he mentioned Henry. The boy would remain at Blackmere. Alistair's reasoning was simple. The heir belonged at the seat of his family. Until that moment, Eleanor had absorbed every insult with remarkable restraint. The affair, Celeste's presence, the servants being forced to watch another woman walk through her rooms, even the announcement that she would be removed from the house where she had raised her son. But Henry saw the change in his mother the moment Alistair claimed the right to separate them. Something in her expression became still, not defeated, resolved. Before she could answer, Henry noticed Celeste touching the emeralds at her throat. He asked where she had obtained them. There was no hesitation from his father. Alistair had given them to her. Eleanor quietly reminded him that the necklace belonged to the Blackmere family collection. It was not his personal gift to dispose of whenever he pleased. Alistair looked at his wife with the confidence of a man who believed his title ended every argument. He was Blackmere. To him, that settled everything. Henry slowly placed his napkin beside his untouched plate. Then he stood. He looked directly at Celeste and told her that she was sitting in his mother's chair. The silence that followed seemed to spread through the entire house. Alistair's face hardened. Rather than acknowledge what his son had witnessed, he turned the humiliation upon him. Henry was ordered from the dining room and warned never to challenge his father before guests again. For a moment, Henry remained where he was. This was the man he had spent 14 years admiring. The man whose approval he had chased across riding fields and hunting grounds. Yet Henry no longer saw the powerful duke he had once wanted to become. He saw a husband publicly humiliating his wife and a father demanding that his son pretend not to notice. Henry left. A chair moved behind him. Eleanor had risen too. Alistair ordered her to remain. She did not. Before following her son from the room, Eleanor looked back at her husband and calmly warned him that he was making decisions about things he had never bothered to understand. Alistair dismissed the warning. At Blackmere, he still believed he held every advantage. The title was his. The household obeyed him. His mother feared scandal. Celeste believed she had already won, and Eleanor appeared to have nowhere left to go. What Alistair did not yet understand was that before the following morning was over, his wife would send a single message to London, and the man who answered it would bring papers capable of changing everything. By the following morning, the scandal had already begun to escape Blackmere. Servants whispered. Carriages came and went. Letters travelled faster than anyone could control them, and within days, London society was murmuring about the Duke of Blackmere, the wife he intended to cast aside, and the beautiful Lady Celeste Vane, who had been installed beneath the same roof before the separation had even been announced publicly. Celeste seemed almost pleased by the attention. She no longer behaved like a guest. She began receiving callers in the morning salon, giving opinions about the household menus, and discussing which rooms would be suitable for entertaining once she began inviting friends from London. She even asked the housekeeper whether the blue drawing room might be redecorated before Christmas. Mrs. Hawthorne answered with perfect politeness and did absolutely nothing. Eleanor noticed. She also noticed something far more dangerous. The estate office had begun sending out new rent notices. Families whose payments had remained stable for years were suddenly being asked for considerably more. Some had already fallen behind after poor harvests. Others had sick relatives, damaged crops, or debts of their own. For several of them, the increase meant only one thing: eviction. When Eleanor confronted the estate steward, the man looked deeply uncomfortable. The orders had come directly from the Duke, and they were connected to the arrival of another man. Lord Edmund Ashcombe reached Blackmere 2 days later. Unlike Celeste, Ashcombe arrived without spectacle. He was in his mid-50s, carefully dressed, quietly spoken, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who did not need to announce his influence because other men already owed him too much money. Alistair received him privately, but their conversation was not as private as Alistair believed. Ashcombe reminded him that the loans could not be delayed indefinitely. The failed railway speculation had already swallowed a fortune, and the mining venture had produced nothing except further obligations. Alistair insisted that Blackmere was more than sufficient security. Ashcombe wanted details: several thousand acres of western farmland, the timber rights from Blackmere Wood, mineral rights beneath the northern hills, and control of 2 of the estate's most profitable tenant districts until the debt was repaid. Alistair agreed to begin the paperwork. By afternoon, the estate steward had been ordered to prepare the necessary documents. That was when Eleanor understood that her husband's betrayal was no longer merely personal. If Alistair wished to disgrace her before society, she could survive it. If he wished to replace her with Celeste, she would endure that too. But now he was gambling with the land Henry was expected to inherit and squeezing families who had depended upon Blackmere for generations simply to satisfy debts he had created in London. Something inside Eleanor hardened. She was no longer fighting for a marriage that had already been hollowed out. She was fighting for her son, and for everyone whose future Alistair was treating like figures on a ledger. Then he gave her another reason. Henry, Alistair announced, would soon be sent away to school until the scandal surrounding the separation had quietened. Eleanor immediately understood what that meant. Distance. Control. If Henry remained at Blackmere, he could see what was happening. He could ask questions. He could choose where his loyalty belonged. Away at school, Alistair could decide when mother and son saw one another. That evening, Dowager Duchess Beatrice came to Eleanor's room. For once, she did not defend her son. She admitted that bringing Celeste into Blackmere had been reckless and humiliating. But Beatrice had spent her entire life protecting a family name older than nearly everyone carrying it, and to her, public scandal remained the greater danger. Men of rank had survived infidelity before, she reminded Eleanor. Families like theirs did not survive public disgrace so easily. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she asked what Henry was supposed to learn from watching his mother accept humiliation in silence. Beatrice had no answer. Later, Henry found Eleanor alone. He apologized for what had happened at dinner. He believed he should have said more, done more, somehow stopped his father. Eleanor drew him closer. He was 14. It was not his responsibility to repair the mistakes of grown men. That was the moment Henry finally allowed himself to lean against her, like the child he still partly was. The next morning, Alistair went further. He formally removed Eleanor's authority over the household accounts and immediately ordered money transferred to cover part of Ashcombe's demand. The response from the estate bank arrived before luncheon. The transfer had been refused. Alistair stormed into the estate office, demanding an explanation. The banker's reply was simple. The owner's authorization was required. Alistair stared at the message in disbelief. Of course the owner's authorization was required. He was the owner, or so he believed. That night, long after the final lamps had been lit, another carriage rolled through Blackmere's gates. Henry watched from an upstairs window as an elderly gentleman stepped onto the gravel. Sir Julian Harcourt had arrived from London, and in his hand was a locked leather document case. Sir Julian Harcourt was shown into the old library without ceremony. Eleanor had chosen the room deliberately. It sat in the oldest part of Blackmere, far from the guest wing, where Celeste had made herself comfortable, and even farther from Alistair's study. Generations of family records filled its dark shelves, and a single fire burned beneath the stone mantel as Sir Julian placed his locked leather case on the table between them. Henry had been told to remain upstairs. He did not. He had come looking for his mother after seeing the solicitor arrive, and stopped when he heard voices beyond the partly closed library door. He knew he should leave. Instead, he remained in the shadowed corridor, listening. Inside, Sir Julian unlocked the case. The truth he carried had begun long before Henry was born. Nearly 20 years earlier, Blackmere had been drowning in debt. Alistair's father, the previous duke, had maintained the appearance of enormous wealth while borrowing heavily against the estate. Mortgages had accumulated. Creditors had begun threatening portions of the land. By the time marriage negotiations began between Alistair and Eleanor, the Blackmere name remained prestigious, but much of the fortune beneath it was already disappearing. Eleanor's father, the Marquis of Ravenscourt, knew exactly how desperate the situation was. He agreed to rescue Blackmere. But he had not simply handed over a fortune as his daughter's dowry. Ravenscourt purchased the estate's outstanding mortgages from its creditors, cleared the liabilities, and placed Blackmere House, together with its principal lands, into a legal settlement. The arrangement was precise. Eleanor would hold the estate for the duration of her life. After her death, it would pass to her first legitimate child, Henry. The ducal title was never part of that arrangement. Neither were certain investments and personal properties belonging separately to the Blackmere family. Alistair had inherited those. He had inherited the title. He had inherited the ceremonial privileges attached to being Duke of Blackmere. But the house from which he now intended to remove his wife had never legally become his. Henry nearly stepped into the room when he heard his own name. He stopped himself. Sir Julian then asked the question that had troubled him for years. Why had Eleanor allowed Alistair to believe otherwise? After all, the Duke's signature appeared on several documents connected with the settlement. At 23, Alistair had been old enough to understand what he was signing, but he had not bothered. Young, proud, and desperate to restore his family's fortunes, he had allowed his father and the solicitors to manage the details. He knew Ravenscourt money was saving Blackmere and assumed the arrangement simply restored the ancestral estate to his family. Eleanor had never corrected him, not because she wanted a weapon to use later, because she had wanted a marriage. She knew what publicly announcing the truth would have done to a young man raised to believe Blackmere was his birthright. Beginning their marriage by reminding Alistair that his ancestral home belonged to his wife would have humiliated him before his family and poisoned whatever affection existed between them. So Eleanor had said nothing. For 13 years, there had been no need. Alistair lived at Blackmere. He managed parts of the estate. He entertained guests beneath its roof. Eleanor never used ownership to diminish him. Until now, he had also never tried to sell what was not his. A floorboard creaked outside. Eleanor turned. Henry knew immediately that hiding was useless. He entered slowly. Sir Julian looked toward Eleanor, uncertain how much the boy had heard. Enough, as it turned out. Henry stared at his mother as the meaning settled over him. Blackmere would someday belong to him, not because his father chose to leave it to him, not because the Duke controlled it, because the settlement had protected it for him before he was even born. For one brief moment, Henry felt something dangerously close to satisfaction. His father had humiliated Eleanor, threatened to send her away, and behaved as though no one could challenge him. Now he was wrong. Eleanor saw the feeling immediately. She warned Henry not to celebrate another man's humiliation simply because that man had humiliated them. They were not trying to destroy Alistair. They were trying to stop him from destroying Blackmere. Then Eleanor turned back to Sir Julian. Her instructions were clear. No mortgage was to be placed against the estate. The new rent increases were to be suspended immediately. No tenant was to be removed because of Alistair's recent orders, and every financial agreement between the Duke and Lord Ashcombe was to be examined before another acre of Blackmere was promised. Sir Julian began reviewing the papers Eleanor had obtained from the estate office. The deeper he read, the more serious his expression became. Alistair had already signed a preliminary agreement with Ashcombe. He had promised Blackmere land as security against his debts. The promise itself could not transfer property Alistair did not own, but that did not make the problem disappear. If Alistair could not provide the security he had guaranteed, Ashcombe could demand repayment directly from him, immediately, and the Duke did not possess enough independent wealth to cover it. Alistair had believed he was risking Blackmere. In reality, he had been risking himself, but Sir Julian had not finished. He reached into the document case and removed a second file. Several weeks earlier, someone in London had formally requested access to a certified copy of Eleanor's marriage settlement. Eleanor went still. Only a small number of people even knew the settlement mattered. Sir Julian turned the request toward her. The name written beneath it was Lord Edmund Ashcombe. For the first time that evening, Eleanor's composure shifted, because if Ashcombe had already investigated the settlement, then he may have known from the beginning that Alistair could never legally give him Blackmere, and that meant the Duke's debt might not be the real prize after all. The dinner Alistair arranged 3 nights later was less a family gathering than a declaration of victory. By 7 o'clock, Blackmere's great dining hall was filled with relatives, neighboring landowners, 2 local magistrates, several titled families, and Lord Edmund Ashcombe, who sat close enough to the Duke to make their alliance obvious. Celeste had been placed at Alistair's right hand. No one had announced her as the future Duchess of Blackmere, but the seating arrangement said enough. She wore pale silver silk and carried herself with the confidence of a woman who believed the difficult part was already over. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. Alistair had expected that. To him, her absence proved she had finally understood the position she was in. When the servants finished pouring the first wine, Alistair rose. He spoke calmly, almost graciously, explaining that rumors concerning his marriage had unfortunately reached society before private arrangements could be completed. He assured his guests there would be no public spectacle. The Duchess, he said, had accepted that their marriage could not continue as it had. Within 48 hours, Eleanor would leave Blackmere House and take up residence at the Dower property. Henry would remain at the estate. Then, Alistair moved to what he called the more practical matter. Several portions of Blackmere land would soon be reorganized in order to resolve temporary financial concerns. Nothing, he insisted, threatened the family's future. Lord Ashcombe lifted his glass. Celeste smiled. Then the doors opened. Every conversation in the room died. Eleanor entered. Sir Julian Harcourt walked behind her, carrying the same locked leather document case Henry had seen days earlier. Henry followed several paces behind them. Alistair's expression tightened. He demanded to know why a solicitor had been brought into a private family dinner. Eleanor did not answer that question. Instead, she stopped opposite her husband and asked something much simpler. By what authority was he transferring Blackmere land? A few guests exchanged uncertain looks. Alistair almost laughed. The answer seemed so obvious to him that Eleanor's question bordered on absurd. He was the Duke of Blackmere. Sir Julian stepped forward. With impeccable calm, he reminded Alistair that Eleanor had not asked what title he held. She had asked what legal authority he possessed over the land. That changed the room. Ashcombe stopped drinking. Celeste's smile faded slightly. Sir Julian placed the case on the table and opened it. Inside lay certified copies of documents executed years earlier, when Blackmere's debts had nearly consumed the estate. He explained that the late Marquis of Ravenscourt had not simply provided money to rescue his daughter's husband's family. He had purchased the outstanding interests held by Blackmere's creditors. Once those obligations were cleared, the principal estate had been placed into a legal settlement. The beneficiary during her lifetime was Eleanor. After Eleanor's death, ownership passed directly to her first legitimate child, Henry. Silence settled across the hall. Henry could hear the fire cracking behind him. Alistair stared at Sir Julian as though the solicitor had begun speaking another language. Sir Julian continued. The Duke possessed his title, certain investments, personal properties, and the rights traditionally attached to his rank. But Blackmere House, its principal farmland, the western woods, the protected tenant districts, and the major estate revenues were not legally his property to sell. He could not mortgage them. He could not pledge them against his private debts. He could not permanently dispose of them. And he certainly could not remove the lawful owner from her own residence. Celeste slowly lowered her glass. Ashcombe understood faster than anyone else. If the settlement was valid, the security Alistair had promised him was worthless. Alistair looked at Eleanor. For the first time since bringing Celeste into Blackmere, certainty had disappeared from his face. He accused Eleanor of deceiving him. For 13 years, she had allowed him to believe the estate belonged to him. Eleanor held his gaze. She had allowed him to believe they were a family. There had been no reason to humiliate him by correcting an assumption that harmed no one. Not until he attempted to throw his son's mother from her own home and gamble away the inheritance meant for that son. Then, Eleanor turned towards Celeste. Her voice remained calm. There was no triumph in it. No raised voice, no insult. Lady Celeste could have her trunks removed before breakfast. For one brief moment, the entire balance of Blackmere had reversed. The woman everyone expected to be expelled now controlled the estate. The Duke, who believed himself untouchable, could not sell a single protected acre, and Henry, whom Alistair intended to keep as though he alone controlled the boy's future, was already the eventual heir to the property. Then Lord Ashcombe stood. He reached inside his coat and removed a folded document. He had been remarkably quiet until then. Now everyone looked at him. Ashcombe said Sir Julian had explained only part of the story. The paper in his hand, he claimed, was a private letter written by Eleanor's father shortly before his death. Its wording suggested that Ravenscourt had intended Blackmere to pass fully to Alistair upon the completion of the marriage arrangements. Sir Julian immediately challenged its authenticity. Ashcombe seemed prepared for that. He asked one question: where was the original registered deed? Sir Julian did not answer at once, and that hesitation was enough. The original had recently disappeared from his London archive. What Eleanor possessed at Blackmere was a certified copy, valid under ordinary circumstances. But if Ashcombe could produce evidence that Ravenscourt later changed his intentions, the ownership could be challenged until the original records were examined. Across the table, Celeste looked at Eleanor. Then, very slowly, she sat back down. Her trunks, it seemed, would not be leaving before breakfast after all. By noon the following day, Eleanor's victory had already begun to unravel. Lord Ashcombe moved quickly. Before Blackmere's household had even finished discussing what had happened at dinner, his solicitors had sent an urgent petition to the Crown's legal office requesting a formal inquiry into the ownership of the estate. Until the dispute was resolved, neither Eleanor nor Alistair would be permitted to sell, mortgage, or transfer any major portion of Blackmere. The contested documents would be examined, the estate accounts would be watched, and any agreement involving Ashcombe's loans would remain suspended. Less than 24 hours after Eleanor had finally asserted control over Blackmere, that control had effectively been frozen. Celeste seemed almost transformed by the development. Until then, Henry had regarded her as little more than the woman who had destroyed his parents' marriage. Now he began to understand that she was involved in something much larger. Sir Julian's investigation uncovered a pattern. Celeste had first introduced Alistair to Lord Ashcombe at a gathering in London nearly 2 years earlier. She had encouraged Alistair's interest in Ashcombe's railway venture, praised the profits other investors were supposedly making, and later urged him toward the mining speculation that consumed even more money. Each time Alistair lost, Ashcombe had been there with another opportunity, another loan, another promise that the next investment would repair the last one. Celeste had known about the debts far earlier than Eleanor had. More disturbing still, correspondence suggested she had also known that a desperate Alistair would eventually try to use Blackmere as security. That did not mean every feeling she had shown him was false. There may have been genuine attraction between them, but affection had never been the only reason Celeste remained at his side. Blackmere itself had always been somewhere in the calculation. For a brief moment, Henry found himself wondering whether his father had been trapped too. Perhaps Alistair had been reckless rather than cruel. Perhaps Celeste and Ashcombe had simply found the weaknesses in him and exploited them. That thought lasted until Henry passed the morning room and heard his father's voice inside. Alistair was confronting Celeste. He demanded to know how long she had known about Eleanor's settlement. Celeste refused to answer directly. Instead, she asked something else. Had he truly intended to marry her once Eleanor was gone? There was a pause. Henry stopped outside the door. His father could have denied it. He could have said Celeste had misunderstood everything. He did neither. Alistair answered that once Eleanor had been removed from Blackmere and the separation completed, there would have been no reason not to marry her. Henry felt something inside him sink. His father might have been manipulated financially, but no one had forced him to betray Eleanor. No one had forced him to give away her necklace. No one had forced him to announce before guests that she would be sent from her home, and no one had forced him to plan a future with another woman while trying to separate Henry from his mother. Whatever Ashcombe and Celeste had done, Alistair had still made his own choices. Elsewhere in the house, Sir Julian was pursuing another problem. The original settlement had not simply vanished. Someone had helped it disappear. One of Sir Julian's junior clerks had accepted an unexplained payment shortly before the deed went missing. When Sir Julian sent men to question him in London, they discovered his lodgings empty. The clerk had vanished. That was when Henry remembered the man. On the night Sir Julian first arrived at Blackmere, Henry had seen an unfamiliar figure coming through the servants' passage near the rear courtyard. He had assumed the man belonged to Sir Julian's party. Now the memory returned differently. The stranger had been carrying a narrow blue document case. Henry told his mother immediately. Then he remembered something else. 2 days earlier, while passing Celeste's sitting room, he had seen several opened letters on a side table. One had been tied with an unusual blue sealing ribbon, the same shade he remembered hanging from the document case. Henry began suggesting that perhaps Celeste's rooms should be searched. Eleanor stopped him before he could go any further. He would not enter her rooms, he would not follow her, and he would not put himself inside a battle created by adults. Henry protested that he might be able to help. Eleanor's answer was firm. Helping did not mean behaving recklessly. Instead, Henry told Mrs. Hawthorne exactly what he had seen. The housekeeper said little, but from that moment, she began watching movements through the east wing with particular care. Her patience was rewarded before midnight. A maid loyal to Celeste quietly requested that a carriage be prepared before dawn. No announcement was made. No farewell was planned. Celeste had apparently decided to leave Blackmere without anyone knowing. Most of her luggage would follow later, but one trunk was different. It was smaller, locked, and Celeste had instructed the servants that it was never to leave her sight. Mrs. Hawthorne watched the trunk being carried downstairs. Then she went directly to Eleanor. Whatever Celeste intended to take from Blackmere before sunrise, she clearly believed it mattered more than everything else she was leaving behind. By the time Mrs. Hawthorne reached Eleanor's rooms, there was no opportunity to stop Celeste quietly. Another carriage had already entered Blackmere's courtyard. This one carried a representative of the Crown. The dispute over the estate had moved beyond family quarrels and private solicitors. With 2 competing claims now before the legal office, accusations of missing documents, enormous debts attached to the Duke, and rumours spreading through London, temporary restrictions had been issued until a formal inquiry could determine the truth. But the estate was no longer the only matter under examination. Henry was. Alistair argued that Eleanor had deliberately turned their son against him. He pointed to Henry's behaviour at dinner, his refusal to obey, and the boy's increasingly open loyalty to his mother as evidence that Eleanor was influencing the future Duke against his father. Until the scandal was resolved, Alistair proposed that Henry be sent away to school. Eleanor understood immediately what that could mean. Blackmere could be restored. Documents could be found. Money could eventually be recovered. But if Alistair succeeded in removing Henry from her influence, weeks could become months. Decisions about visits, letters, and holidays could be placed beyond her control. For the first time since the crisis began, Eleanor was frightened. Henry saw it. That afternoon, he went to his father's study alone. Alistair looked exhausted. The confidence with which he had brought Celeste into Blackmere had vanished beneath days of legal threats, frozen accounts, and whispers that his ancestral home might never have belonged to him at all. Henry did not ask why he had betrayed Eleanor. Instead, he asked the question that had been troubling him since dinner. If his mother had owned nothing, would Alistair truly have sent her away? His father hesitated. He spoke about a marriage that had been cold for years, about Eleanor questioning his decisions, about living inside the house of his ancestors while having to justify expenses to his own wife. Henry listened. Then he asked whether his father would really have made him watch Eleanor leave. Again, Alistair could not answer cleanly. He said Henry was too young to understand marriage. He said a man could become powerless inside his own household long before anyone outside it noticed. Henry looked at him for a long moment. Then he quietly asked why feeling powerless had made him decide Eleanor should feel powerless instead. Alistair had no answer at all. Henry left before his father could see the tears gathering in his eyes. The words remained behind. For the first time, Alistair was being forced to see his actions, not through the eyes of society, Celeste, or himself, but through the son who had once wanted to become exactly like him. Eleanor faced a reckoning of her own. Dowager Duchess Beatrice came to her privately and asked whether 13 years of silence had truly protected anyone. Perhaps, Beatrice suggested. Alistair's resentment had grown partly because he sensed that Eleanor possessed authority he did not understand. Eleanor did not deny it. Maybe she should have told him years earlier. Maybe protecting his pride had allowed something unhealthy to deepen between them. She had wanted peace. Silence, she now realized, was not always the same thing. Then Beatrice revealed the secret she herself had carried for years. She had known about Ravenscourt's rescue of Blackmere. Her late husband had been so ashamed that another family's money had saved the dynasty that he begged everyone involved to conceal the extent of the arrangement. Beatrice produced several old letters written in the previous duke's hand. In them, he clearly acknowledged Eleanor as the legal holder of Blackmere Estate. The letters strengthened her claim considerably, but they were not the missing registered deed, and without that original, Ashcombe could still create doubt. Then Mrs. Hawthorne arrived. Celeste's locked trunk was already being taken toward the station. Sir Julian acted immediately. Because documents connected with the inquiry were potentially being removed from Blackmere, he secured authority to stop the luggage before it left the estate. The carriage was intercepted near the south gate. Celeste protested furiously as the trunk was returned. When it was opened, however, there was no deed inside. Instead, Sir Julian found bundles of correspondence, letters between Celeste and Ashcombe. They confirmed that she had known about Alistair's growing debts and had discussed Blackmere with her uncle long before arriving at the estate. Then Sir Julian found one sentence that changed everything. It instructed Celeste that if circumstances became dangerous, she was to secure what Ashcombe called the chapel papers. Henry immediately looked up. He knew those words. Years earlier, his grandfather had once taken him beneath Blackmere's private chapel and shown him a small stone chamber where old family documents had been stored before modern archives existed. Henry told them. Within minutes, Eleanor, Sir Julian, and several servants were crossing the courtyard toward the chapel. But before they reached it, Mrs. Hawthorne stopped. There was light behind the chapel door, not candlelight, something brighter. Then Henry smelled it. Smoke. Someone was already inside, and whatever Blackmere had hidden beneath its chapel for generations was burning. The fire beneath Blackmere's chapel was smaller than Henry had feared, but far more deliberate. Someone had not tried to burn the chapel itself, only the records hidden beneath it. Servants carried water down the narrow stone steps, while Sir Julian and Eleanor watched smoke curl from an old wooden cabinet built into the wall. Several bundles of papers had already been reduced to blackened fragments, their seals melted and their handwriting lost. But when Sir Julian examined the remains, his expression changed. The original Blackmere settlement was not among them. Someone had intended to destroy evidence. They simply had not destroyed the document that mattered most. Before anyone could search further, shouting came from outside. A man had been caught near the eastern boundary, attempting to leave the estate on foot. Henry recognized him the moment he was brought back, the stranger from the servants' passage. Sir Julian recognized him too. It was the missing junior clerk from his London office. At first, the man denied everything. But faced with Celeste's letters, evidence of the payment he had received, and the possibility that he would be accused of helping destroy legal records, his resistance collapsed. Lord Ashcombe had paid him to steal the original deed from Sir Julian's archive. He had then delivered it to Celeste. Once questions began surrounding the missing document, Celeste instructed him to hide it among the old records beneath Blackmere's chapel until she could remove it without attracting suspicion. Then Ashcombe had changed his instructions. Destroy everything. The clerk admitted that he had burned several papers that might connect Ashcombe to the scheme, but when he reached the original settlement, he could not do it. Whatever money he had accepted, destroying a document that determined the future of an entire estate frightened him more than Ashcombe did, so he concealed it elsewhere. Behind a loose stone at the rear of the archive chamber, Sir Julian found a narrow parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was the original Blackmere settlement. By the following afternoon, everyone who mattered had been summoned to the great hall. Eleanor stood beside Henry. Alistair remained several feet away. Celeste and Lord Ashcombe faced them across the long central table, while Dowager Duchess Beatrice, Sir Julian, the clerk, estate officials, and the Crown's representative took their places around the room. The original deed was examined first. Signatures were compared. Registration marks were verified. The seals matched surviving records. There was no doubt. The settlement was genuine. But Sir Julian had one more piece of evidence. He produced the private letter Ashcombe claimed had been written by Eleanor's father, the document supposedly proving that Ravenscourt intended the estate to pass eventually to Alistair. Then Sir Julian pointed to its seal. At first glance, it appeared authentic. It was not. The particular form of the Ravenscourt family seal, impressed upon the letter, had not been adopted until 2 years after the Marquis of Ravenscourt died. A dead man could not have used it. The letter was a forgery. Everything Ashcombe had built began collapsing at once. The Crown's representative gave the ruling plainly. Blackmere Estate belonged to Eleanor for the duration of her life. Upon her death, it would pass outright to Henry. Alistair's title did not grant him authority to sell it, mortgage it, or use it as security for his personal debts. The money he owed Ashcombe remained his responsibility. Henry's inheritance did not. As for Ashcombe, the stolen deed, bribed clerk, and forged letter had transformed a private financial dispute into something far more serious. Celeste's correspondence made her involvement impossible to dismiss. Her composure finally broke. She turned on Eleanor with years of resentment exposed in a few bitter words. Eleanor had everything, she accused her. The name, the house, the son, the fortune. Eleanor looked at the woman who had entered Blackmere wearing her emeralds and expecting eventually to occupy her place. Then she answered with almost unbearable calm. And still Celeste had believed taking her husband would somehow make her Eleanor. Celeste looked toward Alistair. For the first time, he did not move to defend her. He was beginning to understand what his choices had cost him. That did not make him innocent. When Ashcombe attempted to save himself by claiming Alistair had known about the forged letter, every eye in the hall turned toward the Duke. Alistair could have lied. He could have blamed Eleanor, Ashcombe, Celeste, or anyone else. Instead, he admitted what was truly his, the affair, the debts. His intention to remove Eleanor from Blackmere, the attempt to pledge estate land he had never bothered to confirm he owned. But he denied knowing anything about the forgery or theft. The evidence supported him. He would not face criminal accusation with Ashcombe. He would face something else. Disgrace. Then Alistair looked toward his son. Henry reached slowly into his coat. Years earlier, his father had given him a Blackmere signet and told him that one day it would represent everything he inherited. Henry placed it on the table between them. He did not raise his voice. He simply told his father to keep it until he could teach him what it was supposed to mean. And in that moment, losing Blackmere was no longer the greatest thing Alistair had lost. Several months later, Blackmere was quiet again. The rent increases were gone. Families who had once feared eviction remained in their cottages, and the estate accounts had returned permanently to Eleanor's control. Lord Ashcombe faced prosecution for the forged letter, the stolen deed, and the bribery that had nearly cost Henry his inheritance. His fortune began collapsing beneath legal claims of his own. Lady Celeste vanished from the society pages almost as quickly as she had entered them. Alistair left Blackmere. He remained Duke in name, but the estate finances were no longer his to command. For the first time in his life, he was forced to live within the limits of what actually belonged to him. Eleanor did not take him back. Whatever redemption Alistair might someday earn would require more than regret. Months passed before Henry received a letter from his father. There was no demand for forgiveness, no attempt to excuse what had happened. Alistair asked only whether Henry would permit him to visit. Henry carried the letter to Eleanor and asked what he should do. She refused to make the decision for him. Forgiveness given because someone demanded it, she told him, was merely another form of obedience. Eventually, Henry agreed to see his father. It was not reconciliation. Not yet. Some wounds required more than an apology, and some fathers had to earn again what their sons had once given them freely. One autumn afternoon, Eleanor and Henry walked across the southern fields of Blackmere. A tenant farmer stopped his cart and bowed respectfully to Henry. Without thinking, Henry straightened his shoulders, suddenly looking every inch the future master of the estate. Eleanor noticed. She asked him whether he knew what he had inherited. Henry glanced toward Blackmere House, rising beyond the trees. The estate, he answered. Eleanor shook her head. Responsibility. Henry looked again. Not at the house this time. At the cottages scattered across the hills. At the workers returning from the fields. At the families whose lives could be changed by decisions made inside rooms they would never enter. And Henry finally understood. Alistair had spent his life believing the Blackmere name gave him ownership. Eleanor understood what he had forgotten. A title might tell the world who a man was. It could never tell the world what he deserved. And when Blackmere eventually passed to Henry, the greatest inheritance his mother left him would not be the mansion, the forests, the villages, or the fortune. It would be the knowledge that power without character was merely another inheritance waiting to be wasted. But one question remained. Eleanor had hidden the truth about Blackmere for 13 years to protect her husband's dignity. Did that silence preserve their family for as long as it could, or did it help create the man Alistair eventually became? Hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please subscribe to the channel for more captivating royal stories filled with love, betrayal, secrets, and unexpected twists. And before you leave, let us know in the comments where you are listening from. We always love seeing how far our stories travel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.